The needle slipped. Nellie Ellsworth did not cry out. She never cried out. She simply pressed the pad of her thumb against the small bead of blood, kept her head down, and drove the needle back through the rough canvas of Mr. Hargrove's saddle bag with the same mechanical efficiency she had applied to every task since she was 9 years old. Outside the workshop window, Diablo Creek was settling into its late afternoon lull. The blacksmith's hammer had gone quiet. The saloon at the end of Main Street was just beginning its nightly rumble. Somewhere behind her, the sun was painting the New Mexico territory dust the color of an old wound. She did not look up. She had 17 more stitches to complete on Hargrove's bag. Then she had to finish the hem on Mrs. Platt's riding skirt. Then she had to oil and rebind the 4 bridles that Calloway's livery stable had dropped off that morning. Then she had to boil the week's laundry for the Beaumont household, because their housekeeper had taken fever, and Mrs. Beaumont had let it be known loudly at the general store that Nellie Ellsworth could use the extra coins. Then she had to mend the tears in the 2 shirts belonging to Deputy Cruz, who had gotten into a disagreement with a fence post. Then she had to Miss Ellsworth. The voice was quiet. Not the practiced quiet of a man who wanted something from her. Not the careful quiet of a man who thought she might be delicate. It was simply quiet, the way a river is quiet when it is running deep and unhurried. She looked up. Frederick Shepard was standing in the open doorway of her workshop, his hat held in both hands, his dark hair pushed back and still damp from what must have been the horse trough outside the livery. He was tall in the doorway, broad across the shoulders in the way that comes from actual work rather than intention, and he was looking at her with an expression she had seen on almost no one in her 24 years of life. He was looking at her as though whatever she was doing mattered, and also as though he was fully prepared to wait. She had met him exactly 3 weeks before, when he had ridden into Diablo Creek with a letter of introduction to Sheriff Maddox and a quiet reputation as a deputy marshal sent out of Santa Fe to look into the land fraud that had been bleeding the smaller ranchers dry for the better part of 2 years. She had sewn a button back onto his coat the morning after he arrived, because it had been dangling by a thread and she had noticed it without meaning to, and he had paid her twice what she asked and said thank you like he meant it down to the marrow. "Mr. Shepard," she said, setting the saddle bag down. "If you have brought me more mending, I have not," he said. There was a pause. "I came," he said, and she watched him work through whatever he had decided to say before he arrived, "because it is past 7 in the evening and you have been in this workshop since before 6 this morning. I know because I saw your lamp lit when I left for the canyon at dawn. I know because it is still lit now." She looked at him steadily. "That is not your concern, Mr. Shepard." "No," he agreed, stepping just inside the doorway, still holding his hat. "It is not, but I thought—" He stopped. He looked at the table in front of her, the saddle bag, the riding skirt, the stack of bridles, the pile of shirts, the ledger open at the edge of the table where she had been keeping her accounts in the tiny, perfectly controlled handwriting that was one of the few things she had ever been praised for. He looked at all of it, and then he looked at her hand, at the blood-spotted pad of her thumb. "You have done enough for today," he said gently. The words hit her somewhere behind the sternum. She had never heard anyone say that before, not once. Not in 24 years. Not in the farmhouse in Missouri, where she had been the oldest of 6 children, and had learned to cook at the stove before she was tall enough to reach it without standing on a crate. Not in the years after the fever took her mother, and she had kept the household running while her father stared at the middle distance and occasionally remembered to eat. Not when she had come west after his death with $12 and a sewing kit and the absolute knowledge that no one was coming to help her. Not in any of the 4 years she had been in Diablo Creek, sewing and mending and laundering and hauling and doing whatever needed doing, because there was always something that needed doing, and she was always the one who needed to do it. "You have done enough for today." She did not know what to do with those words. They sat inside her chest like an unexpected warmth, like the first real fire of winter after weeks of cold. And for one terrible, embarrassing moment she was afraid She was going to cry in front of Frederick Shepard, deputy marshal, practical stranger, man who had been in her town for 3 weeks and somehow already seen something no one else had noticed in 4 years. She did not cry. She was Nellie Ellsworth. She had not cried since the day she buried her father. "I have a deadline," she said. Her voice was perfectly even. She was proud of that. "Mr. Hargrove needs Mr. Hargrove," Frederick said, "is currently at the Silver Horn Saloon playing cards and will not need that saddle bag before noon tomorrow at the earliest. I just came past him." She opened her mouth. "Mrs. Platt left town this afternoon to visit her sister in Las Cruces," he continued, still quiet, still holding his hat. "The riding skirt can wait a week. And Calloway told me himself this morning that the bridles are a low priority, that he should have told you so when he dropped them off but forgot, and he was sorry for the confusion." Nellie stared at him. "Did you investigate my workload, Mr. Shepard?" "I asked a few questions," he said, and she could see the smallest trace of something careful in his expression, something that was not quite a smile but was in the same neighborhood. "It is what I do." She did not know whether to be furious or undone. She settled on both, which meant that neither one showed on her face, because she had years of practice at that particular management. "And what," she said, "do you suggest I do with this free time you have identified for me?" He turned his hat once in his hands. "I thought," he said, "that you might let me buy you supper at Mrs. Chen's. She made her pork dumplings tonight. I could smell them from the street." Nellie looked at him for a long moment. The lamp threw warm light across his face. He was not a young man in the reckless sense of the word. She guessed him at 30, perhaps 31, with the kind of steadiness around the eyes that comes from having made a lot of serious decisions and lived with the weight of them. He had a scar along his jaw she had noticed on that first morning. He had never once talked over her. In 3 weeks of occasional, carefully navigated encounters, he had never once assumed he knew what she needed. Until tonight, when he had apparently assumed exactly that. And the maddening, disorienting, frightening truth was that he was right. She set down the needle. She pressed the clean side of her apron against her thumb. She looked at the pile of work on the table, and then at the man in her doorway who had just said 5 words to her that had rearranged something fundamental inside her chest. And she made a decision that felt less like a decision, and more like a door falling open that she had been holding shut for a very long time. "Give me 5 minutes," she said. The smile that broke across Frederick Shepard's face was not the smile of a man who had won something. It was the smile of a man who was relieved. There was a difference, and Nellie noticed it and filed it somewhere close. She had not known, on that particular evening in October of 1883, that those 5 words from Frederick Shepard were the beginning of the great unraveling of everything she thought she understood about herself, about what she deserved, and about the particular dark secret that had been following her west from Missouri like a shadow that refused to die. But she would come to understand it. All of it. Mrs. Chen's eating house occupied the back half of a low adobe building that also served as a laundry, which meant that the air inside was always warm and slightly fragrant with steam and star anise, and the faint ghost of lye soap. Mei Chen had come to New Mexico Territory in 1875 with her husband Guangliang and her mother-in-law, and she had built her small empire of dumplings and soup noodles, and tea entirely on merit and sheer force of will, in a territory that was not always welcoming to people who looked like her family, which Nellie had always understood on a level that had nothing to do with theory, and everything to do with the particular knowledge of a woman who had been told, in 100 subtle and unsubtle ways, that her place was not at the table. May set 2 plates of dumplings in front of them without being asked, poured tea, and disappeared back into the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had learned to read a room. Nellie and Frederick sat across from each other at the small corner table, and there was a moment of silence that was not uncomfortable exactly, but was weighted with the particular awareness of 2 people who are looking at each other and seeing something they had not expected to see. "You grew up working," Frederick said. It was not a question. Is this an interrogation, Mr. Shepard? Only if you want it to be. She picked up a dumpling with her chopsticks, which she had learned to use because May had taught her and she had found them satisfying in a precise, practical way. Missouri, she said, the eldest of 6. Mother died of scarlet fever when I was 14. Father was, she paused. Father was kind when he was present, which was not always. Brothers and sisters still back there, scattered. She ate the dumpling. The 2 boys went further west. The 3 younger girls married. I got letters for a while. She looked at the table. Letters become difficult when everyone is simply trying to survive. I know something about that, he said. She looked up. Where are you from? Tennessee originally. Then I was not from anywhere in particular for a long time. He turned his teacup in his hands. My father was a lawman, his father before him. I thought it was a calling when I was young. Now I think it is mostly just what I am capable of and not much else. That is not a small thing, she said. No, he agreed, but it is not a home either. There was a pause that was different from the first one, softer. What brought you to Diablo Creek specifically? She asked. Beyond the official reason. He was quiet for a moment. There is a man named Clarence Voss, he said. He operates out of Santa Fe, but his reach extends through half the territory. He has been acquiring land through a combination of forged deeds, coerced signatures, and the strategic bankruptcy of small ranchers who cannot afford to fight him legally. Over the past 2 years, 11 families have lost their land to him. 3 of those families had men who tried to resist and were killed in what was ruled accidental death. His voice was even, but she could hear something underneath it. Not anger exactly. Something older than anger. Something that had calcified into purpose. I have been after evidence that ties Voss to those deaths for 8 months. There is a man in Diablo Creek who was present at one of those deaths. A man named Dalton Greer. Nellie went very still. You know him, Frederick said, watching her. Everyone in Diablo Creek knows Dalton Greer, she said carefully. He has the cattle brokerage on the south side of town. He does, Frederick said, and before that he was employed by Clarence Voss as an enforcer. His eyes were steady on her face. Is there something you want to tell me, Miss Ellsworth? She looked at her plate. The carefully constructed wall of composure she maintained between herself and the rest of the world had a crack in it, thin as a needle mark, and she could feel the cold air coming through. Not tonight, she said. He did not push. He simply nodded, ate another dumpling, and shifted the conversation toward the territories, weather patterns, and the particular difficulty of tracking a man through canyon country in October. It was only later, walking back to her workshop in the blue-black dark of a New Mexico night. The stars overhead so thick and close, they seemed to be pressing down, that Nellie allowed herself to acknowledge the thing she had been refusing to look at directly since Frederick Shepard had first ridden into Diablo Creek. She knew Dalton Greer. She knew him because Dalton Greer had known her father, had done business with her father, had been the man who had come to their farm in Missouri in the spring of 1879 with a folded document and a friendly smile, and had talked her father into signing over 40 acres of bottomland for a price that was a third of its value, and a promise of future payment that never came. Her father had been half out of his mind with grief and exhaustion by then, and Greer had known it, and had used it. And when Nellie had confronted him about it on the porch of their farmhouse with her hair still pinned up from a 12-hour day of plowing, he had smiled at her with all the warmth of a man who has never once been afraid of consequences, and told her that her father had signed the papers freely, and that she had better be careful about making accusations she could not prove. 3 months later her father was dead, not from foul play, from the accumulated weight of loss and shame and a heart that had simply stopped finding reasons to continue. But Dalton Greer had been the man who had taken the last thing he had. And now Dalton Greer was in Diablo Creek, apparently, with blood on his hands from at least one killing, and Frederick Shepard was in Diablo Creek looking for evidence, and Nellie had information. She just did not know yet what it would cost her to give it. She lay awake that night for a long time, listening to the coyotes and the wind, and thinking about 5 words that had rearranged something inside her. "You have done enough for today." She was back at her workbench at 5:30 the next morning, not because she had forgotten what Frederick had said, but because she did not yet know how to apply it. Old habits were not iron bars, but they were close. She had the bridles half-oiled before the sun had fully cleared the eastern mesa, and she was working with a focused mechanical ease that left part of her mind free to turn over the problem of Dalton Greer like a stone she was not sure she wanted to look under. When Frederick came to her workshop at 9 o'clock, he did not have mending. He had 2 cups of coffee from the hotel kitchen and a look on his face that said he had also been up since before the sun. "May I come in?" he asked. She gestured to the stool on the other side of the workbench. He set a cup in front of her, sat down on the stool, and was quiet for a moment in that particular way of his that she was beginning to understand meant he was deciding how to say something true. "Dalton Greer," he said, "has a business partner in this town, a man named Ike Morrow, who runs the feed and grain. Between them, they have been facilitating land transfers for Voss for at least 3 years. There are documents somewhere. Records of the transactions that would show the discrepancy between what the sellers were told and what Voss actually paid, and evidence of who gave the orders when things needed to be made more permanent than paperwork." He paused. "I think those records are in Greer's brokerage, and I think he is about to move them." Nellie wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because last night," he said, "you almost told me something, and because whatever you know, it matters, and because," he stopped. He looked at the surface of the workbench for a moment. "Because I do not want you carrying whatever you are carrying alone." She looked at him. The winter light through the workshop window was thin and clear, and it showed her exactly what was in his expression. Not performance, not strategy. Just an honest, steady, almost difficult openness that made her want to look away and also made it impossible to do so. She told him about her father, about the 40 acres, about Dalton Greer on their porch in Missouri with his friendly smile and his folded papers, about the way her father had diminished after, like a fire going out coal by coal, until one morning in the summer of 1879 there had been nothing left to go out. She told him all of it in the same even voice she used for everything, and when she finished, she drank her coffee and looked at the bridle she had been working on and waited for whatever came next. What came next was Frederick Shepard reaching across the workbench and setting his hand briefly, deliberately over hers. "I am sorry," he said, "for what happened to your father and for what Greer took from your family." The warmth of that contact, the plain and uncomplicated sincerity of those words moved through her like something she did not have a name for. "I can testify," she said, "to what happened in Missouri if it helps your case." "It may," he said. "But I will not ask you to do that unless it is necessary, and if it becomes necessary I will make sure you are protected." He looked at her steadily. "I mean that, Miss Ellsworth. That is not a promise I am making lightly." She believed him, which was its own kind of terrifying, because she was not a woman who believed promises easily. What followed in the next week was a careful, methodical dance between information and caution. Frederick moved through Diablo Creek with the particular practiced ease of a man who has learned how to be present without being noticed, gathering pieces, cross-referencing, building a case that was intricate as the inside of a watch. He came to Nellie's workshop every morning with coffee, and sometimes he brought her the small things he had learned, and sometimes he simply sat on the other side of her workbench and they talked about other things, about books, about the territory, about the philosophical problem of whether a person could ever really make a home in a place they had come to out of desperation rather than choice. "I think desperation is an underrated motivator," Nellie said one morning, mending a glove. "It brought me here, and here is not bad." "Here is not bad at all," Frederick agreed, and there was something in the way he said it that was not purely about the territory. She looked up. He looked back. The needle was suspended in midair between them. "You are an unusual man, Mr. Shepard," she said. "I have been told," he said, "though rarely as a compliment. I meant it as one." His expression shifted into something she was coming to recognize as the closest thing he had to vulnerability, a brief, unguarded quality like a shutter opening and closing. "Then I am grateful for it," he said quietly. She went back to her mending, but she was smiling at the glove. She thought he might know it. The crisis came on a Thursday. Nellie had gone to Greer's brokerage not to spy, not to do anything foolish or heroic, but simply because she had 3 leather-bound account books she had repaired for Ike Morrow at the feed and grain, and Morrow's shop was locked when she went to deliver them, and someone at the hotel had mentioned that Morrow was at Greer's brokerage having a meeting. She went to deliver the books. That was all. The door to the brokerage was ajar. She heard voices inside. She should have left. She knew she should have left. Nellie Ellsworth was a practical woman, not a reckless one, and she understood with complete clarity that pushing that door open another inch was precisely the kind of action that made people end up in extremely difficult situations. She pushed the door open another inch. "Can't keep them here," Morrow's voice, high and worried. "Shepard's been asking around. He knows something. He knows nothing." Greer's voice, smooth as water over stone, unchanged from the voice she had last heard on a porch in Missouri 4 years ago. "He has suspicions. There is a difference. What he does not have is paper. And if he gets paper, then he has accidents," Greer said simply. "Like Hendricks. Like Waco Fenn, like that Spanish fellow up in Taos." A pause. "Voss wants the records moved to the Canyon house by Sunday," Greer continued. "We move them Saturday night quiet. In the meantime, Shepard keeps getting friendly with that seamstress, which is either a coincidence or it is not." Nellie stopped breathing. "What do you want to do about it?" Morrow asked. "I want to know if she knows something," Greer said. "And if she does, I want to have a conversation with her about the benefits of keeping her mouth shut and her needle moving. And if she won't." There was a silence that lasted exactly as long as it needed to in order to communicate its meaning without words. Nellie backed away from the door slowly, carefully, the leather books pressed against her chest. She walked back up the main street of Diablo Creek at a perfectly normal pace. She smiled at Mrs. Canton outside the post office. She nodded at the blacksmith. She went directly to her workshop, set the books down on the table, sat on her stool, and spent approximately 30 seconds allowing herself to shake from the inside out, because Dalton Greer had just implied what he would do if she became a problem, and she had heard that kind of implication from men in her life before, and she knew exactly what it meant. Then she stood up, put her shawl on, and walked to the sheriff's office. Frederick was there. He was always there at this hour going over papers with Sheriff Maddox, a large, careful, mustached man who had taken Frederick's investigation seriously from the beginning. Both men looked up when she came in. "Close the door," Frederick said. She did. She told them what she had heard, word for word, her voice steady and precise. She watched Frederick's expression move through several stages, none of which she could fully name, but one of which looked very much like a controlled version of rage on her behalf. "Saturday night," he said. "Yes." He looked at Maddox. Maddox looked at him. "If the records move to the Canyon house," Maddox said, "we lose them. That property is in disputed territory. We'd never get a judge to sanction a search." "Then we do not let them move," Frederick said. He was quiet for a moment. "We go to the brokerage Friday night before they can transfer them." "That requires a warrant," Maddox said. "I can get a warrant. I have a federal letter of authority and enough documented cause to get one from Judge Farnsworth in Las Cruces if I ride tonight." Frederick looked at Nellie. "You are not safe here while Greer is watching you. Is there somewhere you can stay that is not your workshop?" "I can stay with Mei Chen," she said. He nodded. "Go now, take what you need for a few days." And Nellie, he stopped himself as if the use of her given name had surprised him slightly. "Miss Ellsworth, do not go near Greer's brokerage. Do not go near Morrow. If either of them approaches you, you come straight to Maddox." "I understand," she said, and he paused again. There was that quality again, that shutter opening. "I am sorry that you are in this. Truly. You came here to return some account books, and I came here," she said carefully, Because what Dalton Greer does to people matters to me. It mattered to me 4 years ago and it matters to me now." She looked at him. "So go get your warrant, Mr. Shepard." Something in his expression shifted. Not the smile exactly, but something deeper than the smile. He held her gaze for a moment and then he nodded once, with a gravity that felt like a contract. He was on his horse and riding south within the hour. She spent the night at May Chen's, in the small, warm room above the kitchen that smelled of star anise and cedar, and May sat with her and poured tea and did not ask unnecessary questions, which was one of the things Nellie valued most about her. They talked about other things. About May's son Wei, who was 7 and endlessly curious, and had recently become fascinated by the mechanics of the windmill at the edge of town. About the small injustices of daily life in a territory that was not always generous to women who operated independently, and to families who had come from somewhere else and were still finding the particular way the land's rules applied to them. "He is a good man," May said, not specifying but not needing to. "He is," Nellie said. "You are frightened of him." "I am not frightened of him. I am," she stopped. "I am not accustomed to people who pay attention." May considered this. "That is a kind of frightened," she said. Nellie thought about that for a long time after May had gone downstairs. Frederick came back from Las Cruces on Saturday morning with a warrant signed by Judge Farnsworth, executed under federal authority, and 2 additional deputy marshals he had collected along the way, men named Ortega and Birch who were quietly competent and barely spoke, which Nellie found reassuring in the way that quiet, competent, barely speaking people in serious situations are always reassuring. She was not supposed to be involved in what happened Friday night. She had been told to stay at May Chen's. She had agreed. She had meant it. And then at 11 o'clock Friday night, long after she should have been asleep, she had been sitting in the dark above May's kitchen listening to the sounds of the town settle, and she had heard the particular sound of a lock being worked, and she had looked out the window and seen a man moving along the alley beside Greer's brokerage with a box in his arms. They were moving the records a day early. She had a choice. She could wait. She could trust that Frederick and Maddox had anticipated this and were watching. She could do the sensible, safe, promised thing. She went downstairs and woke May, asked her to go to the sheriff's office immediately and quietly, and then did the deeply inadvisable thing of going to see what the man with the box was doing. What the man with the box was doing, she discovered very quickly, was loading documents into a handcart behind the brokerage, and what Dalton Greer was doing was standing in the open back door of the brokerage holding a lantern and looking directly at her with an expression that told her he had at some level been expecting this. "Miss Ellsworth," he said. "What a coincidence." She had faced Dalton Greer once before, on a porch in Missouri, with nothing but her own certainty to stand on. She had lost that encounter. She had walked away from it with nothing but the absolute knowledge that some men believe their own immunity so deeply that it becomes a kind of gravity, pulling everything toward them and calling it natural. She was not going to walk away from this one. "Those documents," she said, "are covered by a federal warrant signed by Judge Farnsworth. If you move them, you are committing a federal offense." Greer studied her. The lantern light was not kind to his face. He was older than she remembered. There were lines around his mouth that looked like they had been cut there by something other than time. "That warrant," he said slowly, "was signed this morning." "Which means someone told Shepard about our timeline." His eyes were flat. "That was you. I heard your conversation through an open door," she said. "You should be more careful." "Should I?" He took one step toward her, not fast, deliberately. "And what exactly do you think you are going to do here, Miss Ellsworth? Stand in this alley and prevent 2 men from carrying boxes to a cart?" "I think," said a voice from the darkness at the mouth of the alley, "that standing in the alley was not the plan, but here we are." Frederick Shepard stepped into the light with his badge and his warrant and his 2 deputy marshals behind him, and the particular quality of controlled authority that she had never once seen him use because he had never needed it around her. And she saw for the first time the full dimension of who he was in his professional capacity, which was formidable in a way that had nothing to do with size or threat, and everything to do with absolute certainty. Greer's man with the box dropped it. "Dalton Greer," Frederick said, "you are under arrest on charges of conspiracy, land fraud, and complicity in the deaths of 3 men across the New Mexico territory. Put the lantern down." What followed was not violent, which surprised Nellie slightly. Greer was a man who understood odds, and the odds, with 3 armed federal marshals in the alley and Maddox coming in from the other end with the warrant and 2 deputies of his own, were not in his favor. He put the lantern down. He was handcuffed with the quiet efficiency of men who had done this before. Ike Morrow, discovered inside the brokerage in the process of stuffing documents into a canvas bag, surrendered in a manner that could only be described as immediately. The box of records was recovered. The documents inside were, according to Frederick's assessment the next morning, more comprehensive than he had hoped. Not just evidence of the land transfers, but detailed correspondence between Greer and Voss, instructions about the men who had been killed, payments recorded in Greer's own distinctive hand. It was, Frederick told her over coffee on the morning after the arrest, everything he needed. Everything and more. She sat across from him in her workshop in the early light, both of them slightly hollow-eyed and vibrating with the particular energy of people who have been through something significant and are only beginning to settle back into their ordinary forms. And there was a silence between them that was very different from any of the silences they had shared before. "You were supposed to stay at May's," he said. His voice was not angry. It was something more complex than anger, something that had anger mixed into it with other things. "I know," she said. "You could have been hurt. I know." Nellie, he stopped. He had been using her given name since the sheriff's office, since the moment she had told him what she heard, and she had not corrected him and did not intend to. "What made you go to that alley?" She thought about this honestly. "Because Dalton Greer has taken things from people my whole life," she said, "and I was tired of watching it happen from a safe distance." He was quiet for a long moment. "I understand that," he said. "I do." But he leaned forward slightly. "If something had happened to you, I would not have." He stopped again. She looked at him. He looked at her. The workshop was very quiet. "I am fine," she said. "Nothing happened to me." "This time," he said, and there was something raw in it, something that was not professional and had not been for a while, and they both knew it. She set her coffee cup down. "Mr. Shepard," she said. "Frederick." His name felt different in her mouth than she had expected. Warmer, more solid. "Are you trying to tell me something?" The expression on his face in the morning light was the most unguarded she had ever seen him. "Yes," he said simply. "I believe I am." She had spent 24 years being entirely self-sufficient in the emotional sense of the word. She had built her life on the reliable architecture of her own competence. She had never allowed herself to need anyone with the specific vulnerability that the situation in front of her seemed to require, because need was a gap in the wall, and gaps in the wall let things in. And things that came in through gaps had a history, in her experience, of being very difficult to recover from. But Frederick Shepard had said, "You have done enough for today," and meant it, had brought her coffee every morning, had sat with her on the other side of her workbench, and listened to her talk about her father and her dead mother and the farm in Missouri and the 40 acres and all the rest of it, and had not once tried to fix it or dismiss it or redirect it towards something more comfortable. Had ridden through the night to get a warrant specifically designed to protect her and the testimony she could give. Had stepped into a dark alley at the exact moment she needed him to, without making her feel like someone who needed to be saved. She thought about all of that. She thought about the warmth in his hand over hers. She thought about the way he smiled, that relieved, unperformative smile. She thought about how very much she did not want to keep walling herself off from this particular thing. "I think," she said carefully, "that I may have some feelings I have not quite accounted for either." The smile that crossed his face then was slow and quiet and devastatingly genuine. "Well," he said, and there was something in that single syllable that contained an entire landscape of feeling. "That is good to know." The weeks that followed were a kind of careful, deliberate unfolding. Frederick had to stay in Diablo Creek through the formal processing of the arrest and the documentation of the evidence, which meant he had time, and he used it the way he did everything else, with intention and no waste. He walked with her in the evenings, through the blue and gold of the New Mexico autumn. He told her about Tennessee and the father who had died in a landslide on a logging road, and the mother who had moved to Memphis after, and the two sisters who wrote him at Christmas and sometimes in between. He told her about the years of drifting after the law had taken him from one edge of the territory to the other, about the year he had spent in Santa Fe thinking he might be done with all of it, and about the particular way that Clarence Voss's land fraud had reached out and hooked him back in, because it was the kind of wrong that compounded itself and could not be watched from a safe distance. She told him about the first quilt she had ever made, at age 11, following her mother's pattern with hands that were too small for the needle and too determined for the difficulty. About the way she had come to love the logic of sewing, the clarity of a problem that could be solved with thread and pressure and a steady hand. About the secret she had never told anyone, which was that she had always wanted to make clothing for its own sake, not just the practical mending work that kept her solvent, but actual garments with design in them, with craft. "Then why don't you?" he asked. "Because mending is what people will pay for," she said. "Craft is for people who can afford to want things." He was quiet for a moment. "You are allowed to want things, Nellie." She looked at the mesa, turning dark purple against the last of the evening sky. "I know that," she said. "In theory." "Theory is a start," he said, and bumped his shoulder gently against hers, which was not much, as gestures went, but which registered in her chest as though he had said something very large. She went home that night and opened her private sketchbook, the one she had kept for years and never shown anyone, full of designs for garments she had invented in her head during the long hours of mending work, and she sat at her lamp and looked at them and thought about what it would mean to believe she deserved to make them. November came in cold and clear. The depositions were filed. Frederick's case against Greer and Morrow was built with a precision that Sheriff Maddox called the best documented federal prosecution he had seen in 20 years of law work. Nellie gave her deposition about Missouri, about her father, about the 40 acres, and it was part of a pattern that demonstrated Greer's methods going back years. It was not easy, the giving of it. She sat across from the territorial judge's clerk in the sheriff's office with her hands flat on the table, and said every word of it cleanly and without hesitation. And when it was done, she went directly to her workshop and sat with her hands in her lap for a very long time before she picked up her needle again. Frederick came to her workshop that afternoon. He did not bring coffee this time. He simply sat down on the other side of the workbench and was quiet with her, which was, she had come to understand, one of the things he was best at. Being quiet with someone without the quiet becoming absence, being present without it becoming pressure. "The land," she said finally. "What about it?" "The 40 acres. Is there any possibility? The land is 40 acres in Missouri that Voss absorbed into a larger parcel he sold 2 years later," Frederick said carefully. "Getting it back would require a separate legal action and several years. I will not promise you what I cannot deliver." He paused. "What I can tell you is that your testimony helps establish a pattern that may result in Voss's prosecution, and that if that happens, there may be remediation for families who were defrauded. It is not certain, but it is possible." She nodded slowly. "I know it cannot be undone," she said. "I knew that before I gave the deposition. I gave it because it was true and because it should be on record and because my father deserved to have someone say, on his behalf, that what was done to him was wrong." She looked at her hands. "That is enough. It has to be enough." Frederick looked at her for a long moment. "You are one of the strongest people I have ever encountered," he said. It was not a compliment in the flattering sense. It was an observation made with the same direct precision he brought to everything. "I have had to be," she said. "I know." He reached across the workbench again, and this time his hand did not lift away immediately. You could choose not to be, occasionally. You could let it be heavy sometimes. She turned her hand under his, not removing it, turning it so their palms were together. Not my habit, she said softly. I know, he said. But I am here if you want to practice. The first time he kissed her, it was December, and there was actual snow coming down outside her workshop window, which did not happen often in that part of the territory, and which had the quality of an event, a special specific thing the sky was doing with no particular reason except its own inclination. She had been standing at her window watching it. He had come in with coffee, which he still did every morning, as though it were a fact of nature rather than a choice, and he had come to stand beside her, and they had watched the snow come down together in a silence that had by then achieved the comfortable, settled quality of a long conversation, with nothing left unresolved. And then he had turned, and she had turned at the same moment, and they were very close, and he had looked at her with that open, honest quality she had never found anywhere else, and he had said quietly, "May I?" And she had said, "Yes." And then his mouth was on hers, warm and unhurried, and outside the snow continued to come down without any particular interest in what the two of them were doing. When it ended, she stayed exactly where she was, forehead tipped against his, one hand on the front of his coat, and she thought with a clarity that felt like something finally falling into its correct place that she had not been wrong to let this happen, that it had not been naivety or weakness or a gap in the wall, that it had been, in fact, a door she had opened deliberately, and what had come through it was not danger but this warmth, this steadiness, this man. Well, she said, which was what he had said to her in September when she had told him she had feelings she had not accounted for, and she felt him laugh against her forehead, low and genuine. Well, he agreed. January of 1884 brought the formal trial. Frederick was required to travel to Santa Fe for the proceedings, which would take several weeks. He came to her workshop the morning before he left and sat across from her, and they looked at each other with the mutual awareness that something was being said between them that neither of them had said in words yet. "I will be back," he said. "I know," she said. "When I come back," he paused. She waited. "I would like to have a conversation about the future, a specific conversation, if that is something you would." "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "I have not finished the question." "I know," she said. "The answer is still yes." He looked at her for another moment, and then he did that thing she loved, that relieved, genuine, unperformative smile. "I was going to ask if you would be willing to have supper with me at Mrs. Chen's," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "Was that all?" "That was the beginning," he said. "I have more to ask after that." She packed him a small parcel of dried apricots and a folded handkerchief she had hemmed with a small, precise pattern of her own design, the closest thing she had ever given anyone to a declaration, and he held it for a moment before he put it in his breast pocket without comment, which told her he understood exactly what it was. The weeks of his absence were a strange, suspended time. She worked. She visited May. She had long conversations with Sheriff Maddox, who was, she discovered, a man of surprising intellectual range who had opinions about water law and Shakespeare and the structural deficiencies of the territorial judiciary. She slept better than she had in years. She did not know how to account for that except to say that something had shifted in her fundamental understanding of her circumstances, and that the shift had to do with the knowledge that someone was thinking about her, specifically and continuously, from whatever room in Santa Fe he was currently in. She also began, carefully, to work on a dress from her sketchbook, not for anyone else, for herself. Deep blue wool with a precise fitted bodice and a structured skirt that draped in a way she had been working out in her head for 2 years. She worked on it in the evenings after the mending was done in the lamplight. It was very good work. She knew it was good. She allowed herself to know it. Frederick came back in late February, thinner across the face, with new lines of exhaustion around his eyes and news. Dalton Greer had been convicted on 6 counts, including 2 of conspiracy to commit murder, and sentenced to 15 years at the territorial prison in Santa Fe. Ike Morrow had received 8 years. And Clarence Voss, the man behind all of it, had been arrested in Santa Fe 10 days before the trial's conclusion, brought in by federal marshals acting on the evidence Frederick had assembled, and was awaiting a separate trial on charges that included murder and large-scale fraud that would, Frederick believed, result in the end of his particular empire and a significant process of remediation for the families he had defrauded, including, potentially, the families who had lost land in Missouri. She sat down when he told her that last part, simply sat down on her stool in the middle of the workshop without planning to, because her legs made the decision without consulting her. "It is not certain," Frederick said quickly. "I do not want to promise I know," she said. "I heard you the first time." She looked at her hands. "It is not about the land. It was never about the land." She looked up at him. "It is about the fact that he was wrong and someone said so, officially, with evidence and a verdict and consequences." She stopped. Her voice was doing something unexpected and she made it stop doing that. "My father would have." She stopped again. Frederick crossed the workshop in 3 steps and sat on the bench beside her, not across from her, beside her, and put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him for a moment with her whole carefully maintained weight, just briefly, just long enough to feel the solidity of him. Then she straightened up because she was Nellie Ellsworth, and old habits were not iron bars, but they were close. "You said," she said, "that you wanted to have a specific conversation about the future." "I did say that," he agreed. His arm was still around her. "We are having supper at Mrs. Chen's tonight," she said. "You can say the rest of it then." He did. He said it over dumplings and tea, in the corner table that had become, without either of them announcing it, their corner table. He said it carefully and directly, the way he said everything, without elaboration or performance. He told her that he had been thinking about what he wanted his life to look like from here on, and that he had been thinking about it more specifically than he usually thought about the future, and that the specificity of it had to do with her. He told her that he was not certain he was done with law work, but that he was certain he was done with drifting. He told her that Diablo Creek was, in fact, not a bad place to stay, and that he had spoken with Maddox about the possibility of a permanent deputy's position, and that Maddox had been enthusiastic in a way that was slightly embarrassing. He told her that he loved her, not dramatically, not with preamble. Just directly, in that quiet, deep river voice of his, looking across the table at her in the warm lamplight of Mrs. Chen's eating house, with the absolute honesty that was the most particular and specific thing about him. "I love you, Nellie," he said, "and if you will have me, I would like to stay." She thought about all the years of choosing practicality over want. All the years of doing what needed doing and never asking whether she was doing enough or whether doing enough for everyone else meant doing nothing for herself. All the years of the wall, the careful, impenetrable, professional, useful, competent wall, and what it had kept out and what it had kept in. She thought about a man in a doorway, holding his hat, saying 5 words that had rearranged something inside her chest. "You have already stayed," she said. "You stayed from the beginning." She reached across the table and her hand found his. "I love you too, Frederick. I have been trying not to make a fuss about it for months." He laughed, that genuine low laugh. "I know," he said. "I noticed." "And you waited. You were worth waiting for," he said simply. They were married in April of 1884, on a morning that was bright and clear and smelled of sage and early blossoms, in the small adobe church at the edge of Diablo Creek with May Chen and her family and Sheriff Maddox and Deputy Ortega, who had come back through on a separate case and stayed for the occasion, and a good portion of the town's residents, because Nellie Ellsworth was known and liked in the particular way that people who hold a community together through sheer competent effort are known and liked. And Frederick Shepard had, in the 6 months since his arrival, proven himself to be the kind of man that a town feels lucky to have. Nellie wore the blue dress from her sketchbook. May cried, which she denied afterward. Maddox shook Frederick's hand for a long time without saying very much, which from Maddox was the equivalent of a speech. And Nellie stood in the morning light in her blue dress next to the man who had told her she had done enough for today, who had sat across from her workbench every morning for months with coffee, who had ridden through the night for a warrant that would protect her, who had put his arm around her in the workshop and not made her feel small for leaning into him. And she made her promises to him in a voice that was even and clear and absolutely meant. He made his promises in the same voice. The spring settled around them like a gift. The life they built was not without its difficulties, because life is not without difficulties, and the New Mexico Territory in 1884 was not without its particular demands. There were hard winters and dry summers. There were legal complications, because Voss's trial dragged on through the summer and into the fall, and Frederick's testimony was required twice more, and the emotional weight of it on both of them was real and required management. There were the ordinary frictions of two people who had each lived alone for years, learning to occupy the same space, the same rhythms, the same mornings. But those frictions were small against the background of what was between them, which was not the dramatic and turbulent love of novels, but something more durable, more practical, more real. It was the love of two people who had each been alone for a long time and had found each other with the particular gratitude and intention of people who know what it is to be without. It was the love of two people who paid attention to each other, specifically and continuously. In June, Frederick built a wider workbench for Nellie's workshop, because he had noticed that she was always moving things off the edge to make room for the design work she was doing now, more and more of it, the clothing she had always wanted to make, and a wider bench was a practical solution. He built it himself, with lumber from the sawmill and precise measurements and a level, and when he showed it to her, she ran her hand along the smooth surface and looked at him with an expression he had come to understand was her version of being overwhelmed. "You measured," she said. "Twice," he said. She kissed him there in the workshop in the warm June afternoon with sawdust still on his hands. In August, they received word from a land claims attorney in Missouri, one who had been retained as part of the Voss remediation process. The 40 acres of bottomland her father had been defrauded of had been assessed and valued, and while the land itself had been sold on and was not recoverable, a settlement had been calculated. The amount was not large. It was not nothing either. Nellie looked at the letter for a long time. Frederick sat next to her while she read it, not across the table. Next to her, close enough that their arms were touching. "It is not enough," she said finally, "for a man's life. For what it cost him, it is not enough." "No," Frederick said, "but it is something." "It is something," he agreed. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the small cedar box on the shelf where she kept the things that mattered: her mother's thimble, her first account book, the handkerchief she had made for Frederick before he left for Santa Fe with the small, precise pattern she had never described to him but that he had never asked her to explain. In September, Nellie discovered she was expecting. She told Frederick on a Sunday evening when the light was doing its particular golden thing with the mesa, and the sage was at its most fragrant, and everything about the world had that quality of extraordinary ordinary beauty that she had begun to notice more and more since she had stopped moving too fast to look. She told him simply, the way she had told him everything, directly and without drama, sitting beside him on the bench outside the workshop in the evening light. He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to her with an expression she had no prior reference for because she had not seen it on his face before, something completely open, completely present, a happiness so uncomplicated it had no shadow in it at all. "Nellie," he said, and could not apparently continue with words, so he simply took her face in both his hands and looked at her. She laughed. "You need a moment," she observed. "I need several moments," he agreed. She gave him several moments. He held her in the evening light with the sage smell around them and the first stars coming out, and she thought about her father and her mother and the farm and the 40 acres and the long road west, and about what it means when the road, having taken so much, finally brings you somewhere. Not perfect, not without cost, but real and warm and entirely her own. The baby came in April of 1885, almost exactly a year after their wedding, which May pointed out was poetic timing and which Frederick said was practical timing, good spring weather for a birth, and which Nellie said was both. It was a boy. They named him Robert for Nellie's father. Robert Ellsworth Shepard came into the world at dawn, hollering with an energy that suggested he intended to be significant in it, and Frederick sat at the edge of the bed and held his son with the same precise, careful attention he gave to everything important, and looked at Nellie over the baby's head with eyes that said everything the moment required without needing any words at all. Nellie looked back. She was tired, bone-tired, in the deep, honest way of a woman who had just done one of the most extraordinary physical things a human body can do, and there was a thought that came to her in that tiredness, uncomplicated and certain. She had done enough for today. But not because she was finished, because she was, for the first time in her memory, truly at rest. Because there was someone beside her who would be there tomorrow and the day after and all the days after that, and she did not have to hold everything up by herself anymore. She watched Frederick with the baby. Robert had his father's dark hair and already a look of intense, focused attention that May, when she came to visit that afternoon with soup and a small embroidered blanket, said was very like the way Frederick looked when he was thinking seriously about something. "He is taking inventory," Nellie said. "Of what?" May asked. "Everything," she said and smiled. They all laughed, and outside the window the April morning was the particular bright gold of a world that has come through its winter and arrived at its season. And in the workshop next door the wide new workbench held a garment half-finished in indigo and ivory, a commission from a woman in Las Cruces who had heard about Nellie Shepard's work and traveled 50 miles to discuss it. The mending pile was there too. It always would be. She was practical. But beside it was the design work, the craft, the thing she had been allowed to want, and both were hers, and neither had to be the whole of her. That evening, after May had gone and Robert had been fed and was sleeping in the small crib Frederick had made with the same precise measuring twice approach he brought to everything, Frederick sat beside Nellie in the easy chair they had moved into the bedroom for exactly this kind of evening, and the lamp was lit, and the night was quiet, and everything that needed to be done had been done, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and neither of them said anything for a while. "Frederick," she said. "That first night, when you came to my workshop and told me I had done enough for today, I remember it." "How did you know?" she asked. "You had only known me a few weeks." He was quiet for a moment, thinking it through honestly the way he always did. "Because of the way you looked," he said finally. "Not tired exactly, something more specific than tired, like a person who has been running for so long that they have forgotten they have the option to stop." He paused. "I recognized it." She looked up at him. "In yourself." "I had been there," he said, "before I understood that it was a choice." She settled back into the curve of his arm. The baby made a small sound in the crib and then was quiet again. "I had never heard anyone say it before," she said, "those words in my whole life." "I know," he said, "I could tell." "I did not like it," she said, "at first. It frightened me. I know that too. It does not frighten me anymore." "No," he said, and she could hear the smile in it. "I noticed." She pressed her hand flat against his chest, over the steady rhythm of his heart, and she thought about all the ways a life can be remade from the inside out, about how the hardest things are sometimes not the dramatic ones, not the arrests or the testimony or the dark alleys, but the small things. The ones that ask you to believe, quietly and without fanfare, that you are allowed to rest, that you are worth tending to, that enough is a real thing and not just a word people say. She believed it now. She had been learning it for 18 months from a man who had stood in her doorway and said 5 words, and it had not been instant, the learning of it, but it had been thorough. The lamp burned low. The night was deep and star-filled outside the window. Robert Ellsworth Shepard breathed in his crib, dreaming whatever new people dream about. And Nellie was still. Not the rigid stillness of someone holding themselves together. The warm, complete stillness of someone who has arrived. The years that followed were years of building. Not grand construction, not the dramatic architecture of ambition, but the steady, quiet, unglamorous building of a life that fits the people who live it. Frederick became permanent deputy under Maddox, and then, when Maddox retired in the spring of 1887, was appointed sheriff of Diablo Creek, which he accepted with the same quiet seriousness he brought to everything, and which the town received with the kind of collective exhale that comes when the right person gets the right position. Nellie's workshop had expanded by then into the adjacent room, which had been a storage space, and which she and Frederick had cleared out together one October weekend, moving boxes and sweeping decades of dust, and arguing gently about the placement of a second window, until Frederick climbed up on the roof and moved the window himself, which resolved the argument in the most efficient possible way. The clothing she made had developed a reputation that extended well beyond Diablo Creek. There was a woman in Santa Fe who wore Nellie's work to every social engagement and told everyone exactly where it came from. There was a merchant in Albuquerque who had inquired about carrying her simpler, ready-made pieces. She had not decided about the Albuquerque arrangement yet. She was thinking about it with the methodical care she applied to decisions that mattered. May Sun Wei, who had been 7 when all of this began and was now 11 and extremely opinions-forward, had appointed himself a kind of unofficial assistant to Frederick, which mostly meant that he appeared at the sheriff's office after school and informed Frederick of everything that had happened in town that afternoon with the precision of a natural reporter. Frederick received these reports with complete seriousness, which Wei found deeply satisfying. "He is going to make a good lawman," Frederick told Nellie one evening. "He is going to make a good something," Nellie agreed. "I am not certain what yet, but he is going to be very thorough about it." The summer of 1887 was hot and dry in the particular relentless way of the territory's bad summers, and there were difficulties with water rights along the eastern range, and a dispute between 2 cattle operations that required more patience than most disputes, and a stage robbery 30 miles out that led to a 3-day tracking operation through canyon country that came back successfully, but left Frederick with a sprained wrist and a long bruise along his ribs that Nellie discovered when she handed him a clean shirt on the 4th morning, and he winced putting it on. "Why did you not tell me?" she said, examining the bruise with the focused attention of someone who intends to take action. "'Cause you would worry," he said. "I was going to worry anyway," she said. "You were gone 3 days. I know, I am sorry for that." She pressed her fingers gently along his ribs, checking for anything worse, and he let her, which was its own language. "Nothing broken," she said. "I know, Birch checked." "Good." She handed him the shirt and then kept her hands on his shoulders for a moment, and he put his good hand over one of hers. "Do not come home with something broken without telling me," she said. "Agreed," he said, "and eat something today, you look hollow." "I will, May promised dumplings." She shook her head at him. 32 years old, and you eat like a man who forgot to have regular meals for a decade. "That is an accurate description of several of my years," he said with complete seriousness. She was still shaking her head when she went back to the workshop, but she was also smiling, and she thought he probably knew that too. In the fall of 1887, Clarence Voss's second trial concluded, the one for murder and the large-scale fraud, with a conviction on all principal counts and a sentence that would keep him in the federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. The remediation process for defrauded families was formalized and administered by a territorial land court, and over the course of the following year, more than 20 families received some form of restitution, partial but real, for what had been taken from them. Nellie kept the documentation in the cedar box, next to her mother's thimble and the handkerchief. The second baby came in March of 1888. A girl this time, which Nellie had sensed for reasons she could not precisely articulate, and which Frederick took as settled fact when she said it. They named her Clara, for no particular person but for the sound of it, which was clean and clear and felt like something you could hold. Clara came into the world more quietly than her brother had, with a focused watchfulness that was immediately apparent and which May said, upon meeting her, reminded her entirely of Nellie, which Nellie pretended to find merely observational and actually found tremendously moving. Robert, who was 3 and had strong opinions about most things, considered his sister for a long time on the afternoon of her second day, and then announced that she was acceptable. Frederick told him that was generous. Robert nodded solemnly. Nellie, from the bed, observed this exchange with a love so enormous and ordinary that it had no drama in it, just the warm, uncomplicated weight of the real. The town of Diablo Creek continued to grow. A new school was completed in the summer of 1888, framed in pine and plastered in adobe, with 2 teachers, and Robert would start in the fall and Clara would follow in a few years. And the particular version of the future Nellie had not been able to imagine on the evening 4 years ago, when a man had stood in her doorway with his hat in his hands, was now so concrete and specific and daily that she sometimes looked at it with a kind of wonderment that felt slightly embarrassing. She had mentioned this once to Frederick, in the way she mentioned important things, quietly and directly without preamble, during an evening walk when the children were with May and the town was settling into its dusk. "I look at everything sometimes," she said, "and I am surprised by it, that it is mine, that I am allowed to have it." He was quiet for a moment, walking beside her. "I know that feeling," he said. "Does it go away?" "I think it changes," he said. "I think the surprise becomes something else." Something more settled. He glanced at her. "I am still surprised occasionally, but it is a comfortable kind of surprise now, the kind you want." She considered that. "The kind where you know the answer before you open it." "Yes," he said, "exactly that." She took his hand as they walked. The evening was cooling and the sage was doing its autumn thing, that intense particular fragrance that she had come to associate not with homesickness for somewhere else but with here, this place, this life, this man beside her. "Frederick," she said. "Nellie." "You have done enough for today," she said, testing the words in the other direction, the direction of giving rather than receiving. He looked at her. "You have been at the sheriff's office since before 6, she said. "You tracked the Donnelly complaint through half the eastern range. You fixed the fence on the schoolyard because no one else was going to do it before Monday. You carried 3 boxes of supplies to Mrs. Yamamoto because her husband is laid up and she could not manage them herself." She squeezed his hand. "You have done enough for today." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in a voice she had to listen for, "That is the first time anyone has said that to me." She stopped walking. He stopped too. She looked at him in the fading light with all the particular clarity of a woman who knows what it feels like to be seen for the first time, and she understood that it was not only her who had been running, not only her who had been holding everything up, not only her who had needed at some point someone to stand in a doorway and say the 5 words. She brought her hand up to his face. He turned into it the way people turn toward warmth. "You are allowed to stop," she said. "I am here." He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them they were very clear. "I know," he said. "I know that now." They stood there in the sage-smelling October dark, the mesa turning black against a sky full of stars, and the town behind them with its lamps and its sounds and its ordinary, extraordinary, ongoing life. And they stayed like that for a while, the 2 of them, until the comfortable surprise of it had settled all the way in and was indistinguishable from everything else they were sure of. Spring of 1889 was the kind of spring that happens when the winter has been hard, and the first warmth arrives with an unexpected generosity, everything blooming at once. The plum trees along the church wall and the wild prairie flowers out on the east mesa, and the old cottonwood by the creek putting out its new leaves in a green so bright it seemed to have its own light source. Nellie had taken the commission from the Albuquerque merchant. 3 designs, her own, produced in small quantities. The merchant had used the word exceptional, which she had read 3 times and still not entirely believed, and had then filed in the cedar box next to everything else that was true. Frederick had negotiated a water rights settlement for the Eastern Range ranchers that 3 lawyers had declared unworkable. through the simple strategy of sitting in a room with both parties for 2 full days, and refusing to let anyone leave until they had found the thing they could both accept. When he came home on the second evening and told her what had been agreed, she listened and then said, "You were the best possible version of yourself today." And he had looked at her with that unguarded quality and said, "You make that easier." Robert had started school in the fall and had opinions about his teacher, his classmates, the length of the school day, and the particular injustice of arithmetic, all of which he communicated at dinner with a precision that Frederick found enormously entertaining, and which Nellie privately also found enormously entertaining while maintaining a more neutral expression. Clara was 1 year old and had 8 teeth and strong views about who was allowed to hold her, which was everyone except the man from the livery who had a loud voice, an exclusion she enforced with the focused intensity of someone who has identified a problem and is committed to its management. In June of 1889, a letter came from Missouri, not from a land attorney this time, but from Nellie's sister Margaret, the youngest of the 3 girls, who had married a farmer near the town of Carlin and had 2 children of her own, and who had been finding ways to write more often in the years since Voss's trial, as though the resolution of that old wrong had opened something between them. Margaret's letter said that she was coming west. Her husband had been offered a position managing a large ranch operation near Socorro, 40 miles south of Diablo Creek, and they were coming in September, and she would be closer than she had been since they were children on the same farm, and she was very much hoping that they could be the kind of sisters now that circumstances had not always allowed them to be. Nellie read the letter twice, and then sat at her workbench for a long time without picking up her work. Frederick found her like that when he came in with the morning coffee. He set the cup beside her and looked at her expression and sat down and waited. "My sister is coming," she said. "Margaret?" "Yes." She looked at the letter. "We have not been in the same room since 1879. That is 10 years. Yes. Are you glad?" She considered this honestly. "I think I am," she said. "I am also." She paused. "There are things between sisters that go further back than anything else. Old arrangements, old patterns. I was always the one who held things together, and Margaret was always the youngest, and I do not know if those things change," Frederick said. "Or whether you change first," she said, "and hope the rest follows." He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup and thought about this with the deliberateness she had always loved in him. "You are not the same person you were in 1879, he said. "You cannot go into that room and pretend to be. So you bring who you are now, and you let her respond to that." She looked at him. "You are very wise for a man who spends a significant portion of his professional life chasing people through canyon country," she said. "I have a thoughtful wife," he said. She smiled at her coffee. "You are shameless." "Also accurate," he said. Margaret arrived in September with her husband Thomas and their 2 children, a boy of 7 named Louis and a girl of 5 named Anne, in a wagon that had been on the road for 3 weeks and arrived looking thoroughly used. Nellie stood in the street outside her workshop while they came down the main road, and when Margaret climbed down from the wagon she was smaller than memory had preserved her, and older, and there were the same green eyes that all the Ellsworth girls had inherited from their mother, and they looked at each other for a moment with all 10 years between them and all the years before that too. Then Margaret said, "You look well, Nellie," in a voice that was trying to be ordinary and not quite managing it. And Nellie said, "Come inside," and put her arm around her sister's shoulders and felt something old and unresolved become something else. They had dinner that evening at Mrs. Chen's, the extended family, Frederick and Nellie and Robert and Clara and Margaret and Thomas and Louis and Anne, around 2 tables pushed together, and May produced an extraordinary quantity of food with no apparent effort, and presided over the whole thing with the serene authority of someone who has hosted important moments before and understands that the occasion requires feeding. Robert and Louis discovered within approximately 10 minutes that they were interested in the same things and were going to be friends, which they announced to the table with the confidence of children who do not see why the adults are being so complicated about something so obvious. Clara sat on Frederick's lap and examined Anne with her usual careful attention. Margaret told stories about the farm, about their brothers in California, about the years in the middle that they had each survived separately, and were only now beginning to reconstruct together. Thomas was a quiet, solid man who clearly thought Margaret was the most interesting person in any room she entered, which Nellie found immediately reassuring in a way that had everything to do with knowing her sister and what she deserved. After dinner, when the children had been taken back by Frederick and Thomas to get them settled, Nellie and Margaret sat alone for a while at the corner table, the same corner table with the last of the tea going cold between them. "I am sorry," Margaret said, "for not writing more, for letting it go so long." "We were all surviving," Nellie said. "You were always doing more than surviving," Margaret said. "You were the one who held everything together. After Mama, when Father," she stopped. "I was too young to understand what you carried. I am old enough now." Nellie looked at her sister's face, the green eyes, the particular set of the mouth that was their mother's. "It is in the past," she said, "and the past has been addressed as much as it can be." "Frederick," Margaret said, "it was not a question." "And Frederick," she agreed, "and May and Maddox, and the good fortune of landing in a place with people in it." "He loves you very much," Margaret said. "I could see it from the moment we arrived, the way he looks at you." Nellie thought about this. "He looks at me like I am worth looking at," she said quietly. "That was new when I found it. I did not know that was something I was missing until it was there." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "You deserve that," she said. "You always have." The words moved through Nellie the way all true things moved through her now. Quietly. All the way down. "I know that now," she said. The winter of 1889 was the kind of winter that tests what a community is made of. A blizzard in December shut the roads for 2 weeks, and the town managed it together with the practiced unself-consciousness of a place that knows how to take care of its own. Nellie organized the distribution of supplies to the households that needed them. Frederick ensured no one was isolated without checking. May kept her kitchen open and warm for anyone who needed it. And Margaret, 40 miles south, but in close enough contact through the restored telegraph line, sent word that the Socorro area was also managing. The ranch operation was good. Thomas was well. The children had built a snow fort of remarkable structural integrity. By February, the roads were clear, and Nellie drove the wagon south to see her sister, with Robert bundled in the back and Clara on her lap, through country that was white and brilliant, and so large it seemed to contain everything that had ever happened in it, all of it still present in the land, the difficult and the beautiful, the loss and the becoming. Frederick had wanted to come. She had told him it was a trip she needed to make herself. He had understood, because he always understood, and had packed her extra blankets and checked the wheels on the wagon twice, and had kissed her at the gate in the morning cold with the specific warmth of a man who is confident enough in what he has to let it go freely for a few days. She had driven south with her children in the bright winter morning, and behind her Diablo Creek had settled into its Tuesday ordinary, and ahead of her Margaret was waiting, and the road between was hers. She had thought, driving, about all the roads she had driven before this one, the ones out of Missouri with $12, the ones into the territory, the ones toward everything she had not known she was going to need. She had thought about how you cannot always tell from inside a road whether it is taking you somewhere or simply moving you, and how the difference only becomes clear after. This one was clear. It had been clear for a while now. She arrived in Socorro in the early afternoon, and Margaret came out of the ranch house at the sound of the wagon with Flower on her hands and Anne at her heels and Louis behind her. And when she saw Nellie, she put her floured hands on both sides of her face and laughed in the pure, uncomplicated way of someone who is genuinely delighted. And Nellie sat in the wagon with Clara in her arms and her son scrambling down to meet Louis, and the February sun white on the snow all around. And she thought with enormous plainness, this is it. This is the thing. Not a specific thing that could be named and labeled and put in a cedar box. Just the ongoing, unglamorous, perpetual accumulation of it. The life. She stayed 3 days. They talked more in those 3 days than they had in the preceding 10 years. Margaret showed her the ranch, the way the land opened up south of the mountains into a long valley that in summer was apparently extraordinary and in winter was merely quietly beautiful. Nellie helped with the mending because old habits, but Margaret also made her sit down while Thomas cooked dinner on the first evening, which was an unusual domestic arrangement for 1889, and which Nellie observed with amusement and pleasure. "He likes to cook," Margaret said, with the shrug of a woman who has found the correct person for her. "So does Frederick," Nellie said, "when he has time. He makes a very adequate venison stew." "Adequate," Margaret repeated. "Excellent," Nellie corrected. "He makes an excellent venison stew. I undersell it because I am not accustomed to complimenting things I like." "You are working on it," Margaret said. "I am working on several things," Nellie agreed. She drove back to Diablo Creek on the 4th day, with the children sleepy in the wagon and the road running long and pale through the winter country. And she thought about everything with the particular quietness of a long solo drive. And by the time Diablo Creek came into view in the late afternoon, its adobes gold in the winter sun and the smoke from the chimneys going straight up in the still air, she felt entirely like herself in a way she was not certain she had ever felt before. Not the self that had been running, not the self that had been holding everything up alone, but the self that had arrived, that had stayed, that had made something real. Frederick was on the porch when she pulled the wagon up. He had been watching for her. He came down the step and took Clara from her arms while she climbed down, and then he looked at her face in the way he always looked, with that complete attention, and said, "Good trip." "Very good," she said. Robert was already inside, having announced his presence at maximum volume. Frederick was still looking at her. She was still looking at him. "I missed you," she said. She had gotten better at saying things like that. It was one of the several things she was working on. "I know," he said. "I missed you too. The house is remarkably quiet without you in it." "I should hope not," she said. "You have an extremely vocal 6-year-old. Who is, as we speak, telling the walls everything that happened in Socorro," he agreed. She laughed, and he smiled, and the February evening settled over everything in the gentle, unhurried way of evenings that know they have time. She went inside to her house, with its warm lamplit rooms and the wide workbench with the half-finished commission on it, and the cedar box on the shelf and the crib in the corner of the bedroom where Clara would sleep, and the sound of Robert's voice filling the kitchen with the account of Lewis's snow fort in extensive structural detail. She was 30 years old. She was a wife and a mother and a business owner, and a woman with a sister in Socorro, and a best friend with a tea house, and a husband who was also the town sheriff, and who built things with careful measurements, and made adequate to excellent venison stew, and who had once said 5 words to her in a doorway that had changed the entire interior architecture of her life. She put her coat on the hook. She put her hands on the workbench. She looked at the design pinned above it, the current commission, deep green wool with ivory trim, for the woman in Santa Fe who wore her work to every social occasion and told everyone where it came from. She picked up her needle, not because she had to. Not because the deadline was pressing, not because there was no one else to do it, but because she loved it, this specific thing, the logic and craft of it, the way a design in her head could become a thing in the world through the particular patient application of her own hands. She worked in the lamplight while the children's voices filled the house and the smell of Frederick's venison stew, which was excellent and not merely adequate, came from the kitchen. And the New Mexico night settled around the town of Diablo Creek with its stars and its sage, and its accumulated history of hard things and beautiful things, and all the ordinary, extraordinary things that make up a life. After a while, Frederick appeared in the doorway of the workshop. His coat was off. He was holding 2 cups of coffee because he still brought coffee every day without fail, because it was a fact of nature now and also a choice, and those two things were not different. She set the needle down. He crossed the workshop and sat on the bench beside her, not across, beside, and he handed her the cup and looked at what she was working on with the genuine interested attention he had always given everything that was hers. "It is coming out well," he said. "It is coming out very well," she agreed. "The color is good." "I thought so." A pause. "You have done enough for today," he said gently, and she heard it differently than she had the first time, not as something that pulled the ground from under her feet but as something solid, something she could stand on, something that would be there tomorrow and the day after and all the days she was lucky enough to have. "I have a few more stitches to finish," she said. "Of course you do," he said, without any protest, because he knew her fully, and knowing her meant knowing that a few more stitches was its own kind of rest, its own kind of pleasure. She picked up the needle. He stayed on the bench beside her. And the lamplight was warm on the deep green cloth, and the stars were out over the mesa, and the children were asleep, and everything that had needed resolving had been resolved, and everything that had been taken had been accounted for, and everything that had been lost had, in the way of things that have run their full course, finally and irrevocably come to rest. The house was quiet. The night was clear. And Nellie Ellsworth Shepard, who had once held up a whole world with her bare hands, and never thought to wonder whether anyone was coming to help, stitched the last row of her commission in the lamplight, while the man who loved her sat beside her in the good ordinary silence of two people who have found their home. And the New Mexico night held everything gently, the way nights do when they know they are part of a story that has finally arrived at its right ending.